This episode is brought to you by the all-new podcast Murder You, an Abnormia original available everywhere. High schools, university campuses, college dorm rooms, they're supposed to be safe havens, but sometimes they're the scene of unspeakable crimes. Join me, your host, Maddie, as I explore the most shocking murders involving students, schools, and universities. Murder You, available wherever you get your podcasts.
This is a podcast.
Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and today, continuing our two-part series on an assortment of American serial killers. This week's episode probably not as weird as last week, all right? I don't think, if I remember correctly, no one gets peed on, all right? No one does anything, like no one gets sex wrong for the most part, all right? I think we're good in that regard. But three more stories this week of some random serial killers from the United States. We're looking at the lives of Ray Copeland, Andre Thomas, and our first story of Dorothea Helen Gray.
Story time. Story time. Story time? Story time.
Dorothea Helen Gray was born on January 9th, 1929 in Redlands, California, to a set of all-star parents. The best, the brightest. Both were alcoholics, and that was actually probably the best part about them. Dorothea's mother was a sex worker, which, fine, do what you got to do, but be a little careful. Don't have kids. Her father tried to commit suicide right in front of her. So probably a little traumatizing for old Dorothea, but whatever. Tuberculosis eventually killed her father when Dorothea was 8, and her mother died in a car accident the following year. She was then sent to an orphanage where she was immediately subjected to sexual abuse because that's apparently what happens in orphanages. In 1945, at age 16, Dorothea married Fred McFall, a soldier who had just come back from World War II. Although they quickly had 2 children, Dorothea gave them both up for adoption. After miscarrying her third child, McFall ended up leaving her. In response, she began forging checks to get by, I guess, because she just didn't have any support, and she spent a year in jail. After placing another child up for adoption, Dorothea met and married Axel Johansson in 1952. Over the next several years, she tried to figure out how to make a living. She spent 90 days in jail for running a brothel. And then after she, I guess, realized that was illegal, she worked as a nurse's aide and managed boarding houses. In 1966, Dorothea divorced Johansson and then ran down to Mexico City, where she met Roberto Puente, who was 19 years younger than her at the time. So she's just really couging it up. 2 years later, the couple divorced, and then Dorothea took over a 16-bed care home in Sacramento. In 1976, she married Pedro Montalvo, but quickly divorced him after discovering that he was a violent alcoholic. Probably just didn't want to relive some of those wonderful childhood memories. Still, I guess, not fully understanding how legal adult life worked. Dorothea began spending time in local bars and hitting on older men who were receiving government benefits. And basically, once she had gained their trust, she would forge their signatures and just steal their money. She was eventually caught and convicted on 34 counts of treasury fraud, but only received probation for this. And again, classic California, not recognizing the worst people, right? Like, she's already got this extensive criminal history. Nothing violent per se, but, you know, She's been convicted of various sex crimes, working as a sex worker. She's run a brothel. She's committed all kinds of fraud. And it's just like, you're probably harmless. We'll just give you probation. In April 1982, 61-year-old Ruth Monroe moved in with Dorothea at her Sacramento apartment. But a few days later, Ruth died of an overdose of codeine and acetaminophen. Dorothea told police that Ruth had been depressed because her husband was terminally ill, and thinking that seemed probable, police were just like, yeah, it's probably just an accident. She probably just took one too many little pills. Oh, silly, senile old bag. Can't read right no more. Anyway, a few weeks later, police were back at Dorothea's apartment after her new roommate, 74-year-old Malcolm McKenzie, accused her of drugging and stealing from him. Dorothea was convicted of theft and sentenced to 5 years in jail. And while she's in prison this time, she began corresponding with 77-year-old Everson Gilmuth. And look, I'm going to be real honest with you right now. I've been pretty harsh on all of these women who made pen pals with murderers and other kinds of prisoners and fell in love with them. Well, fellas, I guess we're not immune to this kind of stupidity as well, because this old 77-year-old sad bozo starts writing to Dorothea while she's in prison on fraud charges and theft charges, and somehow thinks that it's totally fine. She's going to be fine. She's going to learn her lesson. This old woman who has been in and out of prison her entire life for fraud and things relating to fraud. She said, this is it. This was the wake-up call she needed. She's finally going to turn her life around. She surely wouldn't do this to me. Well, guess what? She actually convinced him to drive down from Oregon once she got out of prison and give her a ride in his red 1980 Ford pickup truck. They're just gonna have a cute little fling. All right. Cute little old fling full of Viagra and a lot of lube. Cause I can't imagine there's any kind of natural moisture going on. I don't know. Ladies, tell me if I'm wrong. I just assume that after, I don't know, like menopause, isn't that like, I just assume that's what menopause is. Just everything dries up and some of it falls out. I could be wrong. I don't know. That's the story that I've concocted in my brain when I hear that someone is going through menopause. And it's fine. It's totally natural. You're not less of a woman for that. You have completed your cycle, for lack of a better term. And now you just ride off in the sunset. You caring, maternal, wonderful, glowing, strong woman, it's fine. But I don't know. I'm sure my wife will criticize me when she hears this and she'll be like, you're such an idiot. That's not at all what menopause is. Fine, whatever. I think it would be weirder if I had like a highly detailed working knowledge of what menopause was. Why am I even talking about this? They're just going on a ride in his pickup truck after she gets out from prison. Anyway, later that year in 1985, Dorothea hired Ismael Flores to make some renovations in her Sacramento apartment. She also asked him to bring a 6x3 by 2 foot wooden box, suspiciously the size of a coffin, not weird at all, so that she could, quote, store books and other items. What are those other items? Surely not a dead body. On the way there, she changed her mind, though, and asked if Flores could pull over. After filling and nailing the box shut, she had Flores drive it over to a storage unit that she owned. But while they're on their way there, she changed her mind and asked if Flores could just pull over so that she could just dump the box by a riverbank. And this dude is just like, yes, Mr. Dorothea, it's fine. I don't know what kind of accent he has. This is what I'm assuming. Not weird at all, right? Just like, why would you help this woman fill, and maybe he didn't see her do it, but take this human-sized box full of something, and rather than go to the storage unit, she's just all of a sudden like, let's just dump this box in the river. That's fine. It's probably fine. So as a payment for all of his help, Dorothea gave Flores a very nice, well-maintained 1980 red Ford pickup truck. Who else from this story do we know? Maybe you forgot because I went on that long diatribe about menopause. That is the same truck that 77-year-old Everson Gilmeth had, who wrote to her in prison and fell in love with her. I don't know. Is it a coincidence? Probably not. A few weeks later, a group of fishermen found that box filled with the decomposed remains of an elderly man inside, and not the books and other stuff that Dorothea said she'd put in there. However, investigators couldn't actually identify the body, explaining that he hadn't, they couldn't identify the body because it had been decomposed so much. Dorothea continued to collect Everson's pension, though, and even wrote letters to his family explaining that he hadn't been contacting them because he had been very sick. On top of that, she continued to accept elderly tenants and drug addicts at the care home that she managed in Sacramento, where she would collect their mail and also cash their benefit checks, despite being under a court order to stay away from elderly people and to refrain from handling government checks, because that's all she ever did. And she always got in trouble from it. Even more, her parole officers conducted at least 15 checks of her care home and never found anything suspicious about it, which is wild. Like, she's getting all this mail, probably from people who aren't there anymore, and still just cashing. That's how she's making her living. She's just living off the government. This classic California liberal, living off the government, making my tax dollars. I don't know why I'm whatever. Dorothea then hired a homeless alcoholic named Chief to do some work around the home. She had him dig in the basement to cart out leftover soil and debris to make use of the concrete slab underneath. After she installed a new concrete slab in the backyard garage, Chief just disappeared, which is crazy because Chief is just the local crazy homeless guy. He's just always around, and then he's not no more, and that makes people a little suspicious. Well, on November 11th, 1988, police showed up to Dorothea's apartment and asked about Alberto Montoya, a developmentally disabled man who had been missing for a few days. When police noticed a freshly dug hole in the yard, they decided to check it out, and guess what? They found a body, but it wasn't Alberto's body. It was a completely different person. And then they kept digging, and they found 6 more bodies. And so while police investigated this entire situation, they just stopped paying attention to this old lady, and she fled to Los Angeles, where she actually tried. Like, she didn't even try to stop. She can't help herself at this point. She tried to befriend another old man into giving her his retirement checks for whatever. But because the only thing old people do is watch the news, this guy recognized Dorothea from news reports and immediately turned her into authorities. She was officially charged with 9 murders, including Ruth Monroe, Everson Gilmeth, and Alberto Montoya. After a month of deliberation, she was convicted of 3 murders and was given a life sentence. She died at age 82 on March 27th, 2011. Moving on to Ray Copeland, who was born in Oklahoma on December 30th, 1914. As a teenager, his family struggled during the Depression, like most people. And Ray spent his free time just committing all sorts of rural Midwest crimes, like forging checks and stealing livestock, because that's probably almost definitely more fun than doing actual farm work. He was eventually arrested in 1939 for his crimes and spent a year in jail. After his release, he met Faye Wilson, and the two quickly got married. As rural farming couples in the 1940s tend to do, they had a litter of kids because otherwise there wouldn't have been anyone to help with the farming chores. Of course, money was tight because kids are a financial drain, and boy, do I know it. Love him, but he's expensive. So Ray went back to his life of forging checks and stealing livestock. After spending more time in jail, he was forced to come up with a new plan to make money, since no one would sell him livestock because they thought he was just going to steal it, and he just had a reputation for being a generally awful person. So in 1986, which he's like 72 at this point, Ray finally figured out what he could do. He began picking up migrant workers from a mission in Springfield, Missouri, and he would then disguise them as farmhands and promise them $50 a day for their work. He would then take a single worker to a bank, open a checking account in his name, and then the two would go to the market where they would purchase cattle using bad checks from that account they just opened in this migrant worker's name. After the purchase, Ray would quickly flip the cattle for a profit before the original buyer or the original seller could realize that Ray's check had bounced. And then when the original seller showed up on Ray's property looking for that migrant worker that had bought it from him in the first place, all of these migrant workers had just mysteriously disappeared from Ray's farm and leaving no trace of any purchase whatsoever. Although it worked for a while, like he made some good money doing this, police eventually figured out this scheme that Ray was running and sent him back to jail. Not for long, obviously, because after his release, Ray just went back and started picking up where he left off, because sometimes, prison is not actual punishment for people. It's just like a slight hurdle in the way. For the next 3 years, Ray would pick up migrant workers, forge checks, and then turn cows around for a profit. Finally, though, in 1989, Jack McCormick, a former actual farmhand of Ray's, called the Crime Stoppers hotline to report that Copeland had actually tried to kill him and that he had seen human bones on the Copeland farm. Police were a little skeptical at first until they just took one small look at Copeland's extensive criminal record. In October, a dozen officers and a team of bloodhounds showed up to the Copeland farm with a search warrant. They quickly found 4 bodies in a barn and another body that had been dropped down a well. All of the victims had been shot with a .22 Marlin rifle that police later found in Copeland's home. Police quickly realized that the reason Copeland's migrant farm workers always mysteriously disappeared, you probably figured it out, was because Copeland murdered them as soon as they had brought the cattle back to the farm. Even more, Ray's wife, Faye, had started a habit of making a quilt out of the dead workers' clothing because what? Like, don't burn the clothing. Don't destroy it because that's very incriminating evidence. Let's make a quilt out of it. What an idiot. Faye went to trial for her role in Ray's murders in November of 1990, and she was actually given 4 death sentences for her role as an accomplice. When Ray found out, he was just like, well, those things happen to some, Like, what is that? Like, that doesn't even mean anything. He's just like, yep, that happens. Poor, whatever. What are you going to do? Look, they'd been married for 50 years. He's probably happy to see it. He's probably sick of her. Just like, Faye, we can't keep these overalls. Why are you washing the blood and mud off of them? They're stained. Well, honey, I think they'd make a nice little denim quilt. The kids, they're cold. Can't afford to keep the heat running in the winter. They got to stay warm somehow. So, got to make use of all this extra material you're collecting. Like, what? Anyway, a few months later, Ray was convicted of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to death. Neither Faye or Ray were executed, but Ray died in 1993, and then Faye suffered a stroke in 2002, which left her paralyzed and unable to speak. The next month, Missouri Governor Bob Holden authorized a medical parole, which allowed her to die in a nursing home the following year. Our final story here is of Andre Thomas, who was born on March 17th, 1983 in Muskogee, Oklahoma. As a child, he was fascinated with Bible stories. He took pride in memorizing entire passages of the Bible as if that's an important thing to do. When he wasn't spending time in church, though, he was drawing models of cars and hoped to be an automobile designer one day. That's admirable. All right. He's got dreams. They're legitimate. So that's great. Despite being arrested at age 11 for criminal mischief and becoming a father at age 16, people thought that Andre still had a bright future ahead of him. Unfortunately, Thomas and his teenage wife, Laura, separated a few months after Thomas's 18th birthday, which sent him down a spiral. He struggled to hold a job and became obsessed with trying to figure out the book of Revelation, which, for some reason, people still think is something that predicts the future when it's not. It's very like scholars, pretty wide consensus among biblical scholars. If you didn't know that Revelation is just a coded genre of apocalyptic writing that was describing the fears of how the Roman Empire was going to grow and come after a Christian. It has nothing to do with what's going to happen whenever Jesus decides to come back. It's not it, right? Everything in Revelation already happened. That's it. So if you're one of those people, I'm all for people believing what they want to believe as long as they're not bothering me about it. But I'm trying to tell you, if you're one of those people who think and you're looking, it's the fifth seal. The fifth seal has been broken. No, it hasn't. It has, but it happened like 2,000 years ago, right? It's already done, dude. So let it go. All right. Look at it from a more historical perspective. And, I don't know, stop waiting around for the end of the world. Just live your life. Anyway, after a failed suicide attempt, Andre told friends that angels and demons were fighting in his head. So, he's clearly sane. Doctors worried that he was a danger to society and sought warrants for his commitment to a psychiatric facility, but those warrants were never served. On March 27th, 2004, Thomas murdered his family in Sherman, Texas. He took 3 different knives to stab his 20-year-old estranged wife, their 4-year-old son, and their 13-month-old daughter. He then cut out both of his children's hearts and his wife's lung, thinking it was her heart because he's an idiot, before stabbing himself in the chest. For whatever reason, Thomas couldn't stab himself to death, so he put his family's organs in his pockets and just walked home. When he got home, he called his in-laws and left a message and then turned himself in. I guess called his in-laws and be like, sorry, I murdered your daughter and grandchildren. But Jesus is coming back. It doesn't matter. Thomas turned himself in and confessed to everything. When asked why he felt it was necessary to use 3 different knives, Thomas calmly responded that he didn't want to cross-contaminate their blood and allow the demons inside them to live. Because that's how that works, guys. Like, if you stab a demon-possessed person, you can't use that same knife on another demon-possessed person because then you contaminate the blood. And then the demons can still live because demons, guys, if you didn't know this, demons live on tainted blood. Apparently. I don't know. As Thomas sat in jail awaiting trial, he read the classic Bible passage from Matthew that says, if your right eye offends you, pluck it out. You get it. Thomas, apparently offended and taking the verse extremely literally, then proceeded to gouge his right eye out with his bare hand. Whoa. Oh man, that's crazy. Right? Like, you're just sitting in jail. If that right eye offend thee, pluck it out. You know what? I've seen enough. My eyes have not seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. My eyes have seen some stuff. My eyes saw me murder my wife and children. And I am offended at that. So let me just start digging in here. And he gouges his own eye out with his own hand. Ugh. Despite clearly being insane, the jury rejected the insanity plea that his defense attorney gave and gave him the death penalty instead, which is perfect. Which is exactly what Texas does. Like, for all of Texas's faults, they're pretty smart in their justice system for the most part. California would have been like, oh my gosh, yes, he's clearly insane. Let's just put him in a mental hospital. No, kill him. On December 9th, 2008, Thomas, here's the thing. All right. You gouge out one eye, you can still see. So he gouged out his left eye with his bare hands, and then he ate it whole. He didn't just throw it away. He ate his own eyeball whole. Just swallowed it. I don't know. Did he chew it? That's disgusting. It's gross. Oh. I forgot how, like, I said last week, this week wouldn't have been as crazy as last week. I don't know. This story might have made up for it. I forgot how wild this one was. But yeah, gouged out his other eye and then ate it whole, claiming not just because the Bible told him so, even though it did, but he also claimed that it would prevent the federal government from reading his thoughts, because I guess the government has ways of like looking into your eye. See, here's the thing, guys. Here's what you didn't know. When you go to the eye doctor and you sit down in front of those machines, and whether it's, the first machine, they do the puff of air into your eyeball. That's to open up your brain. That's to open up your pupils to get inside your brain. And then when you're looking at and reading the rows of letters, P, X, G, for all that, that's the government reading your brain. That's the government reading your thoughts. All right. It's not the NSA reading your emails. No, they don't need that, because they can read your thoughts with the eye doctor. So I don't know. Following another appeal, the Texas courts reasoned that Thomas was, quote, clearly crazy. They literally said that, clearly crazy, but also still technically sane under Texas law, which makes a lot of sense because mental illness isn't real in Texas, right? Anyway, they upheld the death penalty. As of right now, he is still on death row. He was scheduled for execution on April 5th, 2023. However, a month before, State District Judge Jim Fallon delayed the execution date, giving them a little while longer to request a competency hearing. And that's the last that we've heard of Andre Thomas. So I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if he's got a new hearing for competency, if they'll just keep kind of going through appeals and all of this, but whatever. He hasn't been executed yet, and he probably never will. It'll probably just drag out until he, I don't know, hopefully just kills himself. That's it. An assortment of American killers in the books. Let us, try to land this plane and see what we learned today.
What did we learn?
As I'm looking at this and producing this, I have a feeling that the What Did We Learn music just played at a random point during Storytime last week and may have just ruined the entire experience for you. And if that happened, I'm sorry. I'm not going to go re-record it. I clearly didn't. So, whoops. Anyway, number one, Dorothea Helen Gray just spent her entire life scamming old men out of their pension and their retirements, and finally got caught for it because she was plastered all over the news and old people watch the news. Number two, Ray Copeland also couldn't just do a job like a normal person. Had to go and murder some migrant workers and homeless people and do some cow fraud. Sure. And number three, this obviously is the most important. Listen, if you choose to believe and live your life by the Bible, just know that you don't have to take it literally. All right. If your right eye doth offend thee, you don't literally have to gouge it out. All right. If your hand, like if you can't stop jerking off with your right hand, you don't have to cut off your hand. You could, sure, but you don't literally have to. All right. It's Jesus. Jesus spoke in riddles and in metaphors and stories. There's probably a deeper meaning behind it. All right. Just don't take it literally is my point. Right. So that's it for today. Next week on the show, what is it? What are we doing? It's another weird fun bag because it's a new month. We're going to cover an autistic heist. Yay! Representation. We're going to talk about a weird family vacation, and we're going to talk about a guy who's living the dream. And boy, I love that story. All right. Next week's going to be all over the place, but it's going to have some uplifting moments in it. I can promise you that. So thanks so much for continuing to listen. Keep telling all your friends and keep it weird.
This is a podcast